So our earlier presentations were designed to give you some context into the issues around net zero. So while this afternoon's sessions, they're intended to deliver the detail on how to deliver net zero buildings. We'll start with our panel session today, Legislating for Energy Efficiency in Australia and New Zealand, Compare and Contrast. I'm pleased to welcome CIBSE committee member Jeff Robinson, who will be chairing this session.
All right, well look, thanks very much, Mark. This session is about something that I'm very passionate about. It has a rather dry title, Legislating for Energy Efficiency in Australia and New Zealand, Compare and Contrast. But the subject and what we are going to hear from our expert speakers about is anything but dry. And our two speakers share my passion for the power that energy legislation can have on the quality of people's lives, both now and through reducing carbon emissions in the future. To start with, I'd like to tell you a quick story. The coldest winter that I've ever experienced in my life was the first winter I spent in Australia in 1998. I was living in Melbourne, but came to Sydney to help on the redevelopment of the Conservatorium of Music. And I was staying in a house that was absolutely freezing. I was so cold because the house had poor insulation, leaked like a sieve, and had no heating, because I was told, well, it doesn't get very cold for very long in Sydney. I was struck by the contrast of where I had recently come from in Ireland, where the average low winter temperature is about 2 to 3 degrees. Ireland had progressively increased its energy regulations, and new houses were well insulated and airtight and were comfortable to live in throughout the year. These regulations have continued to increase, and there are now minimum insulation standards for rental properties and programs to improve the insulation of those that are poor. You see, building energy efficiency isn't just about isn't just a carbon emission issue, it's a health issue. More people died in their own homes in the week before the 2009 Black Saturday fires than died in those tragic fires. Many of those who died were those most vulnerable in our society, the old and the poor, who lived in poorly insulated homes without air conditioning. Our climate is changing, and we are already experiencing hotter and longer summers and more extreme temperatures, and this will get worse. We have a legacy of millions of homes that were built before our current energy regulations came into place, and many of the new homes that are constructed do not meet the 6-star standard that the law says that they were to be constructed to, because we have a big issue with enforcing compliance with energy regulations in Australia. So you see, this is anything but a dry subject, and as I mentioned before, our two expert speakers share my passion for the transformative power of good energy efficiency regulations, which is enforced to improve the lives of millions of people living in Australia and New Zealand. Our first speaker today is Francesca Muskovic. Francesca is the National Policy Manager for Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs at the Property Council of Australia. She works with representatives from Australia's leading property companies to develop policy and to advocate for federal, state and local governments. Francesca has over 12 years of experience in the built environment sector and is passionate about diversity, ethics in leadership, and advocating for ambitious public policy to support a transition to a zero carbon economy. Welcome, Frankie. Our second panelist is Andrew Eagles. Andrew is a qualified economist with more than 14 years experience in the built environment, working for consultancies, associations, government and built environment charities. He has a wealth of knowledge in housing, market mechanisms, advocacy, and the construction supply chain. Andrew joined the New Zealand Green Building Council in September 2016 as its chief executive. I'd like to hand over now to Frankie to present on legislating for energy efficiency in Australia. And then she will be followed by Andrew, who will talk about the same subject from a New Zealand perspective, before we engage in some Q&A and can compare and contrast the two different approaches to legislating for energy efficiency. As you see these presentations, please use the Q&A facilities throughout the talks to ask your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, for the lovely introduction. Well, I just want to say that it's a pleasure to be with you, Jeff, and Andrew, as well as the CIBSE crowd. I've really enjoyed my time working on the CIBSE Advisory Board a little while ago. And as Jeff said, I am super passionate about the subject that we're talking about today. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see how we go. Now, hopefully you can see a lovely slide that's showing every building counts and a beautiful cityscape. So I'm going to give you a whip around Australia in terms of what policy work is underway for legislating energy efficiency. Before I do that, I was really touched by the Maori welcome to country this morning at the start of today's seminar. And I do just want to flag that we at the Property Council are committed to reconciliation, and we're working on our own RAP at the moment, and I'm having a lot of fun leading that work. So just wanted to put a plug in for NAIDOC Week, delayed from its usual time in July, but encourage everyone to engage with our own wonderful Indigenous culture. So why are we here and why is this important? Well, buildings account for over 50% of Australia's electricity use and almost a quarter of its emissions. So in terms of our commitment, our global commitment to reducing emissions, buildings are a big part of the story. A focus on energy efficiency, I think I don't have to tell anyone on this seminar, brings enormous benefits. It brings benefits in terms of bill savings. It contributes to our energy productivity. And if we had a strong focus on energy efficiency in the building sector, we could meet over a quarter of our current national emissions target, even though there's a question over whether that's strong enough. From our perspective, it surely isn't. Just on this point, I do want to say that in the building sector, our leading companies lead the world in sustainability benchmarks. The real challenge in the Australian landscape is extending that leadership to the sector more broadly. And that's why legislation and policy development is so crucial here. So when we talk about government and industry work, in terms of plotting out what the policies we need look like, there's been enormous amounts of work over the last, I'd say, 5 to 6 years in particular, from federal and state and territory governments around the country. So you've seen, and I'm going to focus in on the trajectory for low energy buildings for the purpose of this chat with you all. But there are other policy mechanisms like the National Energy Productivity Plan, the National Construction Code, which I'm sure Jeff is particularly interested to dive into, and I'm dealing with that in some detail here. But that's been supported by an enormous amount of industry-led thought leadership. Industry comes together under various banners. A really important one is the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, or ASBEC, and they produced a couple of landmark reports, Low Carbon High Performance, Built to Perform, and those were backed in by other industry associations' work, such as Every Building Counts, which was an initiative of the Property Council and GBCA, as well as work of the Energy Efficiency Council. So the basis for what I'm going to take you through is the trajectory for low energy buildings. So this one flew under the radar, and well it did, because we all know that the debate in energy and climate policy in Australia has largely been focused on supply side issues and the extent to which renewables are decarbonising the grid and how quickly that should happen. Under the radar, there has been an enormous amount of work going on in the buildings policy space. So you may not know this, but in February last year, the Commonwealth and every state and territory government signed up to a trajectory for low energy buildings. And that was basically a commitment from every government in the country towards zero energy and carbon ready buildings by 2030. Now, other key commitments in the detail of that policy include looking at increases to minimum standards in the building code. I'm going to speak to that, as well as a commitment to look at a range of options to deal with existing buildings, which we know is a particular challenge, even just reflecting on Jeff's opening story around cold and uncomfortable drafty homes, which I'm sure Andrew can speak to in a lot of detail in the New Zealand context as well. Some of the policies I'm going to take you through echo or I guess can be drawn on these kind of themes. This slide comes from the work that I mentioned before, Every Building Counts, that the Property Council and GBCA put together. This policy measures could be considered, I guess, a shopping list of carrots, sticks and tambourines. So I'm going to take you through commercial buildings first. There are a number of important initiatives underway. I know people have a particular interest in the National Construction Code,
close my browser,
as well as other important policy mechanisms for commercial buildings in Australia. That includes expanding neighbours, looking at how that can be leveraged in the commercial building disclosure program, and work on financial incentives.
I have tried it.
I might just note that somebody else's mic is on and that's sort of coming into the background. So that looks like that stopped now. So just diving in. Okay, so the National Construction Code. Back in 2016, that shifted to a 3-year review cycle. So we're not seeing the kind of annual updates that really didn't provide much of an opportunity for really strategic review of the code provisions. Now, in 2019, so the last revision of the code, we saw a complete overhaul of Section J. It was the first time such a review, I think, had been done of that part of the code since it was introduced. So on average, I'd say the sum total of the changes to Section J produce about a 35% increase in stringency, and that sort of varies building to building, but in general, you could put it at that level. Really key changes there were a shift away from looking at building wall fabric and glazing separately and moving to a whole of system U-value approach. We saw thermal bridging actually drawn out of the, I guess, the provisions. They were sort of buried within the code and really brought out and clarified for industry, which has a significant impact. We also saw pretty significant, and for this audience of interest, increased efficiency requirements for most of the services, with lighting just bringing it up to BAU with LEDs, fans, pumps, boilers, chillers, you name it, increases in minimum performance requirements there. We also saw the introduction of new verification methods, which paves the way for the use of neighbours' commitment agreements as a compliance pathway, as well as Green Star. And then we also saw the introduction of a voluntary blower door test method, which I know Jeff is also extremely passionate about. In 2022, which is the next revision of the code coming up, and that work's been underway since, I'd say, early 2019, there's not such a focus on increasing stringency for commercial buildings, noting the massive jump we had in 2019. But what we are looking at is a range of provisions that would ensure that buildings, and this is from class 2 to 9, so all commercial buildings plus apartments, have electrical capability and structural allowance to be PV, EV, and battery ready. So some of those items there are sort of currently being worked through by the Building Codes Board. And then when we get to 2025, we will be looking at further stringency increases, likely to be focused in the services. And there's ongoing work on updating climate files to make sure that those are not just fit for purpose right now, but there's a live discussion about, whether we use projected climate scenarios to account for the kinds of conditions that we expect buildings to face throughout their lifetime. And that little circle in the corner really just illustrates why this is such an important part of policy making in Australia. The work that we did with ASBEC in 2018 found that 51% of the buildings that are going to be around in 2050 haven't been built yet, or they would be built after 2019. So it's incredibly important that we're having a focus on minimum standards up front. Other really significant areas of work in the commercial building space include the expansion of NABERS. Now, NABERS is a world-leading program for what it does. We are the envy of the world. In fact, the UK is looking at licensing NABERS, and there's a really great progress happening on that front. I know New Zealand licenses NABERS there. It really provides a strong foundation on which you can hang a lot of other policies, like incentives, like government procurement requirements. We've just seen that it's an option to comply with the National Construction Code these days. I can't emphasise how important NABERS is to the Australian policy landscape. But NABERS doesn't cover every kind of commercial building or major building type. And it's certainly, not used by all the buildings in the sectors that it covers. So there's quite a bit of work at the moment, and this is sort of building on NABERS' strategic plan for the next 5 years, which has a goal to expand to every major building type, which is incredibly exciting. And we've been, doing our bit to lobby the government to make sure that they're funded properly to deliver on that commitment. So this is a bit of an advertisement for what you can expect to see in the next couple of years. NABERS is right now engaging with the residential aged care and retirement living sectors, and they will be producing a benchmark and rating tool for those sectors in the next year. The next the next cabs off the rank, if you like, will be your more industrial, so general warehouse, cold stores, the logistics side of things, as well as public and private schools, which involve quite a bit of engagement with government. And then I guess the really exciting bit, which is that bottom row there, NABERS Accelerate. This is a way of leveraging technology. So I guess benchmarking is a very labour-intensive process. You need a lot of data. We wanted to create a soft entry for NABERS. So this is going to be using an online platform that will allow building owners in any sector to upload data, and NABERS will start to build a picture of whether their energy use is good or bad, and start kind of getting them on the pathway towards benchmarking and ultimately producing ratings in those sectors. CBD program, I'm just going to skip over a bit. I want to just highlight why this is such an important program. We've had mandatory disclosure for offices now since 2012, I guess, when you would have had the first sets of data. And what that's seen in that time is a 27% drop in energy intensity of commercial buildings. It's an incredibly important program, which is why you have a lot of industry stakeholders supporting its expansion. What we also know from data in the program is that it proves the adage that what's measured is managed. So buildings that do more ratings perform better. And, we do see some sort of graduation by size. But just to go back, this program was reviewed in 2019, and government was meant to announce its decisions on what we expect them to do with the program. They've put that off because of COVID, but the draft recommendations were to look at changing the trigger from a sale or lease to a periodic disclosure. So if you're not selling or leasing a building like a lot of mid-tier offices do, so they don't change hands very often, they don't tend to lease large amounts of floor space, you'd still be just having to disclose your rating every couple of years potentially. It was also recommended to expand to office tenancies, which is a huge development, and potentially also expanding to hotels with a transition period and support for early ratings. So that's really exciting, and hopefully that comes off. But obviously in the COVID context, that all becomes a bit of a hard conversation. On incentives, very quickly, at the federal level, really not much exciting to talk about there, but there are a range of things that they could be doing that would be quite effective, particularly in terms of tax policy. And at the state and territory level, there's been more progress, I'd say, through state-based white certificate schemes. At the moment, under this trajectory for low energy buildings, they are considering a range of incentives. These are the ones shown up on the slide. I'm not going to talk about those now, but if people have questions on that, I'm happy to come back to it in more detail later. Lastly, on commercial buildings, government leadership is really important here. We saw that in the office market when early on in the days related to mandatory disclosure, we saw a real step change in performance in the office market, and that was largely driven by government's requirements to occupy premises with a certain NABERS rating. So it's really important that governments seek to lead through those sorts of policies. And if I may say, with my industry hat on, compliance with those policies and sort of stronger measures in other areas is a little bit variable through the country. So this is certainly an area for improvement. Switching tack to resi. It's not going to surprise anyone here, and I think this is a major, point of difference between Australia and New Zealand so far. In the Australian market, residential buildings account for just over half the emissions from buildings. But compared to all that activity we've seen in commercial buildings over the last little while, we've seen, comparatively less progress, certainly in comparison to our international peers, but even domestically compared to work on commercial buildings. So what are we talking about in terms of residential buildings? What's underway at the moment? There's a huge amount of work in the National Construction Code, and I'll get to that. We're also looking at a rating scheme for existing homes. So basically something like NABERS for existing homes, and the potential to link that to a mandatory disclosure scheme. There's also work underway on minimum rental standards and appliance standards as well. So 2019 for residential buildings, there wasn't a stringency increase on the table then, but what they did do was separate out heating and cooling load limits for the fabric and removed, the worst performers from that scale. So a slight increase in requirements, but really nothing that could be considered a major stringency increase. But in 2022, we're seeing, again, a bit like commercial buildings in 2019, a large scope of work being pursued here. We're looking at two options. One is the equivalent to a 7-star NatHERS for the building fabric and net zero regulated energy. Bear in mind, this doesn't, the code doesn't cover all of the energy use in a home, so this doesn't apply to everything. The second option is a little less ambitious, still 7-star thermal performance, but with a small energy budget. They're also going to be introducing a whole of house assessment that's going to allow some trading between services, not the fabric. You'd still be needing to achieve the 7-star equivalent, if you like. But if we're looking at an energy budget, or certainly the net zero regulated energy option, That does imply a requirement for a certain amount of on-site PV, obviously subject to feasibility. Other really important work that doesn't get spoken about so much in the context of energy efficiency, but it's really important, is work on air tightness and moisture and condensation management. It's really important that we tackle those issues at the same time as looking to lift standards in energy efficiency. We don't want to see issues with mould and condensation cropping up even more than they already do in the Australian building context. And in 2025 and beyond, again, if the net zero option doesn't stack up this time around in 2022, it's likely that that would be adopted in the next code revision. And again, there's more work to do on thermal bridging in residential buildings, as well as work on future climate files. Just to illustrate where we are in the development timeline, I mentioned this work started very early on last year, I'd say probably earlier than July. Right now, consultants are doing the technical work for the provisions. Normally, you would expect to see consultation on a RIS, so that's a regulatory impact statement, and potentially draft provisions in February next year. I expect there's going to be a couple of months delay, noting the impact that COVID's had on both consultants' ability to deliver the schedule of work on time, as well as industry's ability to respond. So I would expect some delay to this timeline. Very quickly then, one I'm really passionate about. I can speak, all day about neighbours and the benefits of neighbours, but we have nothing like that in the residential space, and it's a real shame. We do have, a scheme at the state level in the Victorian residential scorecard, but what's really exciting is that the federal government and states and territories have agreed that they're going to use the Victorian res as the basis, overhauling it a little bit, but as the basis for something that could be used nationally under the banner of NatHERS. So the next year is a really critical time in policy making in the resi space, because you've got pretty significant minimum standards increases on the table in the code, and you've also got all this groundwork going into what could form the basis of a mandatory disclosure tool for homes. So it's very exciting, and from an industry perspective, we're very much trying to draw on the experience of neighbours in informing appropriate governance of such a scheme, as well as the kind of communication that needs to go out there to the market. And in this case, that's homeowners and renters. Very quickly to wrap up, minimum rental standards need to be affected at the state level. We haven't seen that much progress in Australia on this kind of legislation in the past, certainly not compared to European countries, for example. But there is some work underway to look at that. They've been doing some benchmarking between states and territories. I think Victoria has probably done the most early work in this space. So watch that space. There's going to be more to see over the next couple of years there. Very lastly, appliance standards. So most people should be familiar with GEMS and MEPS. They're looking to expand those to other appliances over time. At the moment, there's work underway for an energy rating label for space heaters, and work to revise the MEPS for incandescent and halogen lighting. So that was the quickest whip around I could do of the legislative landscape in Australia, but I'm very happy to take questions, and I'll probably leave it there. Thanks, Jeff.
Well done, Frankie. Frankie, thanks very much for the excellent presentation in terms of huge areas covered, and there's clearly a lot happening at the moment, but it's obviously going to be fairly critical what happens over the next couple of years to keep that trajectory up. And whilst you see lots of positive things going ahead, I found it a bit disappointing to go and see that in Western Australia they were holding off on implementing a lot of their regulations, supposedly because of COVID.
Yeah. So I think adoption of the NCC is a real issue in Australia in terms of when states and territories do it. So WA has always given itself an extra 12 months, from the point the code's published. So WA, I think, for as long as I can remember, when a code goes live in 2019, they're not going to adopt it for a year after that. Even worse, I don't know how much you know about the Northern Territory's building regs, but they have not formally adopted Section J for commercial buildings, at least, ever. So we've been in close dialogue with the NT government for the last 3 years about them coming up to speed with Section J in the NCC up there. And they're having some, they're actually got a work program in place to adopt it. But I think, all that goes to show that it's really great to have a national construction code, one code that's consistent nationally. But we do see when it gets to the, the point of states and territories adopting it, add their own variations, which is never helpful, I think, if you're an industry that's wanting to understand, what they need to do across the country. And to your point on compliance, that inconsistency is not helpful, but even when it comes to adoption. So I guess our view would be every state and territory should commit to adopting it at the same time and in full. WA's decision is disappointing because unlike sort of the rest of the country, where May this year, the only thing that was really rolling over was the transition period for Section J, WA decided to put it off because they felt that it was too big a change to adopt the whole new code during that period of time, even though the rest of the country's been operating with it for almost 12 months.
Well, because I have lots of friends in Western Australia, I won't say anything derogatory, at least not online.
Ina mana, ina reo, ira rangatirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A huge welcome from the New Zealand Green Building Council. I'm really looking forward to the discussion with you. Just to echo some of those thoughts from Frankie, what a brilliant summary, particularly like the update on the National Construction Code and to hear about the expansion of neighbours. Fundamentally agree with the drive for rating tool for existing homes. I'll touch on that briefly. I also really liked hearing from Melanie and Carolina from the Young Engineers Network. That was really inspiring, I thought, and a great summary of what's going on. While I'm doing that, I don't have a slide on this, but I'll just talk to it. I've chosen to focus on the Building for Climate Change program that MB have released just a week ago here in New Zealand, because it's probably the biggest change we've seen in about 40 years in the regulation of buildings and energy efficiency. So it's really exciting, and I wanted to share that with you. So my slides aren't as pretty as Frankie's, but I can provide a bit of an update, and I really look forward to your thoughts on that. Now, just while we're waiting for those slides to come up, I can give you an update on some government leadership which is happening. So we do have Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, Department of Internal Affairs, Ministry of Justice, a number of New Zealand councils like Auckland Council committing to Green Star on their new buildings, and also some committing to Green Star performance on their existing buildings. Separately, we have Kāinga Ora, who is our state housing provider and also urban development entity, building to Homestar on the homes that they're building. So that's really positive. Homestar is our tool to focus on energy efficiency, construction waste, water efficiency, and adaptation to climate change. So that's very positive to see. And last year, following questions in the House, we had Minister Parker announce that government would be looking for neighbours ratings on the office buildings that they lease. So the New Zealand Green Building Council, where I work, have been advocating for neighbours to come into New Zealand and for greater uptake. We administer that scheme on behalf of the New Zealand government. We are seeing some government departments lead with building to 5 Green Star, and that includes Ministry of Health, Ministry for Environment, Department of Internal Affairs, Ministry of Justice and others, and we continue to talk to other government departments. And we have some councils, generally the larger ones, Auckland Council, Wellington Council and Christchurch Council, either building to Green Star as a policy or looking to build to Green Star in general. So that's really positive. And then on residential, the government state housing provider, Kāinga Ora, is building to Homestar, the standard for energy efficiency, water efficiency, less construction waste to landfill, and a better standard than the building code. They're building to 6 Homestar for all of their state housing and also their urban development work. So that's again above the building code. And then just a couple of other minor points. I'm going to focus on the building for climate changes to our building regulations for new buildings. But it is worth noting that in August of last year, Minister Parker announced in the House that government would be looking to take up neighbours on the office buildings that government departments lease. So this is a really good step forward. The New Zealand Green Building Council has been lobbying for this for some time. And it's great to see that being taken ahead. We would prefer mandation. We will keep championing that, but at least we'll see a good rise in uptake through government properties. And then finally, I really liked Frankie's call for more action on existing homes. We do have now minimum standards for rental properties called the Healthy Home Standards, came in through the Rental Tenancy Act amendments. And they require landlords to, within 90 days of new tenancies from the 1st of July 2021, to have met the Healthy Home Standard, which is a minimum 120 mils in the ceiling, underfloor insulation, adequate ventilation and appropriate and safe heating. There's a few more things like ground vapour barriers, but we have a very good proportion of our homes, 20 to 30%, are damp and mouldy. So this step for rental properties is a big step forward. So that's a bit of a background on some things, but I'm just going to focus on very briefly the Building for Climate Change program. So we're the New Zealand Green Building Council, and our vision is all homes and buildings in Aotearoa green and sustainable, making healthier and happier New Zealanders. And he says, wanting to flip to the next slide. I just want to do that. And what I wanted to talk through with you, can everybody see that? We collaborate with 73 other countries, including the UN and the EU, to drive change. And our membership is all of the publicly listed property companies, the banks, insurers, government agencies, councils, engineers, architects and others. We've now hit 540 members driving that change. And it's a really special time in New Zealand because we now have tools for new buildings. You'll know Green Star, but also homes. Homestar I mentioned, existing buildings and existing homes in the new tool Home Fit, which confirms if homes meet the new Healthy Home Standard. So just a general summary of what's happening in our sector before I get on to the regulatory changes. We've seen a 60% growth in the uptake of Green Star design and as-built, interiors and Green Star performance, and also seeing Green Star communities start to take off in New Zealand. And then the Homestar tool, helping to deliver higher insulation standards, thermally broken low E windows, better sized heat pumps and heating systems, less waste to landfill, prioritising accessibility, better homes throughout New Zealand, particularly in south of Auckland, where there's greater need for heating. And then finally, in the last year and a half, we have introduced advancing net zero tools and policy. So the two steps we've taken is we launched a zero carbon roadmap for Aotearoa's buildings, and setting out how we can in New Zealand get to zero carbon buildings, including a call for government to change the building regulations, which is now happening, and energy labels and other steps we could take for regulatory change. We also launched a carbon zero building standard, which builds on the NABERS standard and Green Star performance. So I'll just give a little bit of context to change in New Zealand and then talk to the new proposed legislation. So some of the drivers for significant change in New Zealand are real standout ones are the Zero Carbon Act. So the carbon budgets will be set to meet the Zero Carbon Act next year. Buildings account for 20% of New Zealand's carbon emissions, so a lot lower than other countries due to our large stake of renewables in our grid. Local government climate change declarations, the majority of councils have launched those, and an increasing rise in investors wanting green assets. There's been another important development in New Zealand, the climate-related financial disclosure requirements, which are going through the House. These will bring minimum requirements for reporting for banks, insurers, asset owners, and asset managers, and it's likely to come into effect in 2022 or so. Of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are really driving change for some of the larger asset holders and developers. We always thank our corporate sponsors. And then I'd just like to move on to the regulatory changes in the new build sector. So ever since I came back from London, we have been hearing from our members about the poor state of the New Zealand Building Code. So the International Energy Agency has commented that our building code is below standards required of most IEA countries, and the OECD has called that out as well. We have low levels of insulation, no requirement to deal with thermal bridging, no requirement for efficient heating, no control for overheating, and nothing on water efficiency or lighting efficiency. So we've been pushing for change on this. And I'm delighted to say that following a lot of work, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment has recently issued, a week and a half ago, a consultation on their Building for Climate Change program. So this is a plan to change the building code to reduce operational emissions in line with the Zero Carbon Act, which calls for zero emissions by 2050, reduce embodied carbon, and improve resilience to climate change. And I thought this is really exciting. So I wanted to share with you what this was and encourage submissions from those in Aotearoa. So there's this ideal state that the consultation lays down of the future in 2050, where well-being of New Zealanders are improved, people have more money in their pockets, and our infrastructure finds it easier to respond to demand for water due to our lower water use. And this is really great to see, because often the narrative in New Zealand is how we're going to build more renewables, but there was a real recognition in this consultation that it's also about energy efficiency and driving that change. So the focus of the work from MB is structured in two ways. Operational efficiency, which of course looks at direct and indirect emissions from the operation of buildings, water use, and then they've included occupant health and well-being in that transforming operational efficiency, and whole of life embodied carbon emissions. And that's quite exciting because not many jurisdictions have dealt with that before. I really welcome knowledge from SIBSI members on their experience on embodied carbon emissions from around the world. So I'm just going to give some feedback that NZGBC has on what we're seeing so far, but the operational emissions are, as one would expect, the direct emissions for fossil fuel combustion, indirect emissions from electricity use, the electricity generation mix, and then the indirect emissions from water use, and the water emissions factor to factor in the intensity of that water use. Then we've got these really exciting caps that have been developed for the initial phase, and then moving to an intermediate cap and a final cap. So you can see here a range of different caps from operational emissions, fossil fuel combustion, electricity use, which is broken down below that into thermal performance demand, services efficiency, and then finally water use. And we agree with this methodology in some ways. We wonder whether this is a little bit complex and suggests potentially that a two-cap approach for energy may be simpler, just looking at space heating and overall carbon emissions, because the latter includes fossil fuels and would therefore incentivise their reduction naturally anyway. And then further, we had some other feedback. I'd welcome thoughts of your members. We do need all emissions to use low amounts of energy, so those caps are helpful. But at the beginning of the trajectory, it may be that different building typologies use different amounts. So it may be that we need more nuanced caps for typologies. And then New Zealand is a very long, skinny country. We have different temperature zones. So we would suggest that it may be a bit unequal at the moment, and it may be better to have those caps regionalised. So it would be far harder for buildings in Queenstown than Auckland. And then people are going to start looking at this, so we need to get that methodology out early, because unless we know that, it's hard to know actually what these targets mean. And then we also have a sense that those targets as fixed energy and carbon amounts are fine for residential, but for commercial buildings, consultants often use a variety of thermal modelling software. So many of the CIPSE members may have experience with that. And so we're suggesting, like the Building Code Australia and UK building regs and how Green Star works, to use that two-model approach where an actual building is assessed against a reference building in the same software package. And then something that's really close to my heart is I've always been jealous of the energy performance certificates that the EU have. And I don't know about you, but we're not sure that kilowatt hours per metre squared is a commonly understood metric by most people. So we wondered whether energy labels might be better for the consumer to understand homes. And that would mean that, let's say the cap was at, say, 60, for instance, a consumer could go out and ask for an A-rated house, which is better than the building code, and not have to understand too much about the actual metrics to be pushing that. It also provides the potential to add in existing buildings and homes. So, for instance, you could have E-rated and F-rated homes, but poorly insulated homes and buildings. So, it may include other metrics, but the Energy Performance Certificate mandated in the EU since 2006, we think is a really positive model, and that Kiwis deserve to know how healthy their home is before they buy that, whether it's new or existing. Because if we're just putting labels or caps on new buildings, how will people compare that with existing homes? We really want to incentivise the uptake of higher performing A to C rated homes. We can do that better if we have that illustration of how existing homes are performing also. And then it's really exciting to see that the public sector being asked to lead. So here you can see on the screen the setting out in that bottom row there that public sector buildings are looking to meet the intermediate operational efficiency requirements earlier than all private sector buildings. And then at step 3, public sector buildings meeting the final operational efficiency requirements earlier again. So we think that's quite positive. I saw that model in the UK where Code for Sustainable Homes was leading the building code, building regulations changes in the UK. The final goal in terms of all these changes is 2013 for uptake, and we would suggest it would be good to go further and faster if at all possible, but that's where they're setting down those requirements for the cap and also indoor environment quality. So indoor environment quality parameters that are proposed are air temperature, range, relative or absolute humidity range, ventilation rates, surface temperature, hygienic surface temperature factor for the avoidance of mould, and daylight provision. We also think it's really important that the Building Act is amended because some councils have wanted to push for higher standards and they've been restricted from doing that because of the Building Act. So this is a way councils could drive this further faster. Summertime overheating isn't included in the building code changes at the moment, and we think this should be dealt with. And we think it's important to watch out for the issues of moisture. So as we get more airtight, we need to consider this. Indeed, we think maybe we should be thinking about it even now. There is, for renewables, on-site renewable energy generation and storage are not required as part of the operational emissions cap. However, they could be used to meet the requirements for fossil fuel reductions, so instead of fossil fuel. The NZGBC there, we think it's worth considering incentivising electricity storage. This could be effective in reducing grid peak demand and space needs to be provided for batteries, etc. And then we really like the model in Australia where you have alternative pathways for compliance, including neighbours' commitments and Green Star, and we think it's useful to add these and potentially other methodologies also. I'm probably a bit over time, so I'll skip water use, but it's just focused really on reducing the amount of portable water required to operate a building as opposed to recycling systems. So embodied carbon, just really quickly, it's that whole of life embodied carbon calculation, and they've got a focus on thinking about the size and the quantity of the building, increasing building material efficiency, so using less material in the new buildings, reducing waste and minimising replacement over the building's life cycle, and then reducing the carbon intensity of the materials. So it's good to see a broad perspective here in terms of how they're considering that embodied carbon calculation. And again, there's less certainty on timing here, but again, the public sector are being asked to lead ahead of the private sector. So you can see it's step 2, new public sector buildings to meet the whole of life embodied carbon initial caps, whereas new buildings are just to report at that stage. And there's more of a sense that this is to evolve over time. As I said, the methodology to be developed over time, pilot projects with the public sector to be taken up, and as a baseline, MB will develop a simplified calculation tool that can be used for small buildings. And then, of course, it's ultimately a capping of whole-of-life embodied carbon for buildings to be carried out as part of the building consent process. So really engaging that right in at the consenting stage. So we just have a few questions here. You know, how will we deal with supplier-specified EPDs versus industry-wide ones? We really think it needs to be accompanied by a massive industry engagement plan, and we need to be really clear that if it's going to create real changes for a particular building material, say concrete is less likely for some structures, we need to say that up front. And we need to invest heavily in designing out waste education. There's a lot of talk about a data repository, and we're in favour of that. Our question is, how do we manage imported products and materials? I'd be really interested in thoughts of attendees. It's just worth signalling the research we did last year, where we looked at embodied carbon. We found that it's equivalent to 1,200,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent savings from reducing embodied carbon, or almost 500,000 cars off the road, and set out how we could reduce concrete, aluminium, steel in the short term and longer term, and the implications for houses and buildings. So just some actions you could take to drive this all forward. We think there's a potential risk that the new minister, we have an election on the 17th of October, so we call on SIBSI members and others to write to political parties to ask them to commit to this framework. We would welcome people feeding back to the NZGBC on your initial thoughts, on your thoughts on our suggested submission. We will be circulating an initial draft through our social media channels, so let me know if you'd like that. And we're a bit worried that this will lead to inertia for some time, with officials saying, well, this change is coming, so we don't need to do anything. So we'd really encourage you to get clients to still deliver better buildings now, with whether that's Passive House, Green Star, Homestar, Neighbours, or the Living Building Challenge. And something that's really close to my heart is energy labelling of existing buildings and homes at point of sale. Let's do it.
Absolutely.
And I say that because we've seen the power of your Neighbours scheme. This is something that DPI has shared with me, but that power of Neighbours delivering a huge uplift in 4, 5 or 6 star rated buildings that we can learn from Australia, and that huge amount of savings for Australian businesses and government taxpayers. And we know that the world scientists are saying that in every sector and every decision we need to cut our emissions as fast as possible, so that curve doesn't get too steep. We're in this together. I really look forward to the discussions and your thoughts as we talk through these changes. I hope that's been really useful. A big kia ora.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's fantastic and an absolutely terrific presentation. Time's a little bit short, so we're going to try and make as much get as many questions in as we can. I suppose what I'd like to do is just start off by asking both of you, you both sort of saw each other's presentations, and what thoughts you had on what you liked from what Andrew, what you like, what did you like about what Australia is doing, and then Frankie, what did you like about what New Zealand was doing, and what would you like to beg, borrow, and steal and apply to each other's?
Yeah, I'm just the thing that I'm most envious about when I look across the ditch to New Zealand is that you have Homestar as a start. So I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be in a position to go for mandatory disclosure at sale or lease in New Zealand. You've got the foundation for that now. I wish Australia was in that position. I can't help but think where we are in terms of the economic recovery that we're now staring down the barrel of. And, the international energy agencies said that 15, more jobs come from upgrading building stock than almost anything else you can do in the energy sector. So we've put paper after paper out there talking about a buildings-led recovery. And in the resi space, the foundations aren't there the way they are in the commercial space. The other thing I really like about the policy reform that Andrew, you just sort of took us through, that government's going to lead over there, is that it's a lot more holistic than it is in Australia. So I think we're some ways away from having embodied energy integrated into our building code. And there's work on a circular economy policy and stuff like that. But, having a broader view of sustainability in buildings embedded in the building code is something I'd love to see. But I think that's a slightly longer term objective for us.
Maybe while we're waiting for Andrew to come back, Frankie, can I just ask you, one of the challenges that I see in Australia is that we've got lots of regulations. We've actually had plenty of regulations for a fair period of time, going back to, at least 10, 15 years, whatever. One of the challenges is, and to buy a house in Australia, you are supposed to get a 6-star rated home. And if you got that would be quite a good thing. But there's so many studies that have been done by CSIRO and various other people which have looked and seen that actually that's a rarity and that there is a real issue with compliance. And it seems to me moving forward, we're going to increase stringency and a number of other things. And yet, how are we actually going to ensure that what we are asking for in our regulations is actually being delivered by the people who are designing and building the buildings?
And now I can't see.
I'm really happy that you raised that, because I find sometimes, discussions I have with sustainability wonks, if you like, are a little siloed from all the work that's happening in the regulatory reform space, which because of the hats I wear, I have to be very engaged in both. There's an enormous amount of work going on around enforcement and compliance reform in Australia. So we really strongly supported the Shergold-Weir report that was produced in 2018 that made 24-odd recommendations. So it has to start with full implementation of that suite of reforms. Some of the and a lot of that is really foundational. So just so you know, some of the conversations I was having with the ABCB around the registration and licensing framework. So we're talking about all major building practitioners needing to have common requirements for registration. We haven't had a category for people who are doing the energy analysis for Section J. There's no requirements on people designing, the ESD part of commercial buildings to have any form of qualification. That blows my mind. So that stuff is being dealt with through the implementation of Shergold-Weir. I think the challenge is, that's really good detailed work, but it takes time. So we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. There's a huge amount of work going on to kind of bed that stuff down, but it also requires state and territory governments coming to the party and agreeing to adopt consistent approaches. And there's very few examples I can draw on where that's been done really well without states going off on their own tangents. You've already seen some really, I think, quite good work anyway from New South Wales government putting in place David Chandler as the building commissioner, and taking a very strong approach to auditing and enforcement on Class 2 buildings, which is where we know some of the bigger some of the issues are in the New South Wales market. So it takes time. There's work underway. I could speak all day about that because it's a big part of my job at the moment.
I think the other area that I think there's the compliance component about how well qualified people are and what gets done. But I mean, one of the things you mentioned, the fact that I'm obviously a strong advocate for when you have a house that you actually have some proof that the insulation has actually been installed, and that there is efforts to make sure that the buildings are properly sealed. Taking into account what you were saying about, we obviously have to go and design, perhaps mechanical ventilation systems if we make our buildings more airtight and so on. But it would seem to me that the ability, when we have a house, at the moment you have an electrical certificate and you have a plumbing certificate. I think at a very low cost, you would be able to go and get a blower door test done and thermography, which would actually give you some proof that the building had insulation in the right places and that was airtight, and that would give hopefully change practice. Because if you and you could start with quite a wide air tightness bands and things like that, but over a period of time, as people gain more skill, you'd increase that kind of stringency. And I think that would have the advantage of people actually, the builders actually changing habits. And that's ultimately what we want to do. We want there to be a high care factor about what gets done. Now, I suppose, what are your thoughts about what the barriers are for that, getting something like that to happen? Because it's not very expensive, but, change is challenging in this industry.
It is, but I mean, I would say that we've got a voluntary method now in the code for blower door testing. That people might not have been too excited about that coming in, but it's put there with the expectation that at some point that could be mandatory. So you're not gonna go from 0 to 100 overnight, and so through this iteration of the code review, we've been talking with forget the name of the peak association for the blower door people, but we've been having conversations with them about how ready the market is for that, and looking to do some sort of scaled testing projects across the country to see what our baseline is when it comes to air tightness. Because one of the challenges we've got is data. And if you want to make change to building codes, you need to kind of prove what the cost benefit is. So you kind of need to know where everything's at to establish a baseline. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg conversation about some of that, but I think that's going to be resolved as we, take a progressive approach to dealing with those issues over the next few years. The other part of it is around the inspection regime that sits over compliance. So you kind of point out at the moment there's not a consistent inspection regime that's set out across the country and what people need to look for. That's part of the work that's been done with the Shergold-Weir reforms. So, with the Property Council hat on, energy and energy efficiency is a priority for us and our members. So we've been seeking to make sure that even though that report was drafted, I think at a time when fire safety was very much at the top of people's minds, that these reforms need to apply more broadly to different parts of the code. So I would expect that mandatory inspection regimes that come out of this work would include requirements for, verification of different parts of Section J as well as other.
Yeah. Look, we're going to have to wrap up shortly, but I was just going to ask one very last quick question, which is really about, I know we've spoken about, this is primarily about legislation, but it's also really about kind of attitudes in the industry and a willingness to go and change. And I'd like to just kind of your thoughts on, there's a number of groups that you deal with on a regular basis about trying to persuade them that we can make change, and that actually making change about, say, improving the way in which our buildings are built is actually good from a world skills point of view. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we encourage that to happen. And the last thing I was going to ask is change within the both development and tenant community about attitudes of what a climate-ready or a climate emergency building should look like, because a lot of the buildings that we're building now, whilst there is big progress in terms of HVAC systems and electrical, less progress has been made in terms of building envelope performance and designs appropriate to that. I mean, why aren't we seeing more designs that have external shading systems on things like that? We're still seeing an awful lot of glass block commercial buildings in Australia.
Yeah, you just touched on, one of my passion kind of areas, right? Like, I think in the last 5 years I've bemoaned to you over and over again on, why and so this is the dialogue that I've seen play out on reviews of Section J in Australia. Architects or designers, even tenants, at that I'm talking about that sort of top end of the market, but it applies a bit more broadly in other asset classes. Want the views and the amenity and all this stuff, and you go around and see glass boxes in CBDs with the blinds drawn most of the time because the glare is so bad. I think the real challenge though is the connection between practitioners at the right time in the building design cycle. So I hear a lot of complaint and commentary that the performance, in terms of meeting Section J requirements often falls to the services engineer because the architect's already specified a pretty glass box and there's not enough two-way dialogue. I was hoping, and this happened in Germany and other countries like 30 years ago when they, increased the requirements of their building code. It forced a more active dialogue and conversation between those parties earlier because, and it should happen under the 2019 code provisions, because you've seen a whole of system U-value approach and the services have ratcheted up. So there's not that you should be able to trade off necessarily between those two things under JV3 so much, but it happens, and there shouldn't be room. There's not enough room to move now, I don't think. So I would expect to see a bit of a shift away from the glass box in response to the 2019 code, and certainly more use of external shading, because if you're not using thermally broken double glazing or triple glazing on facades, I don't know how you could meet the requirement, to be honest, for full curtain wall construction. So unfortunately, I think when it comes to things like that, the regulation needs to prompt the change, because I don't see the culture shifting just because
Absolutely.
It's a nice idea. And so to your earlier question about the voices in the room on this sort of stuff, it's different between minimum standards for new buildings and existing buildings. The groups that you're referring to love the idea of a mandatory disclosure scheme for existing buildings, because that's going to generate more work for their members. Ultimately, you would see an increased awareness and desire to do something about poor performance once you're aware of it, and you've got an easy way of kind of addressing it through supportive government policies and the like. So it's I wouldn't say that it's a homogenous discussion. I think you rightly point out change is hard. I think it's not so much the the arguments that are made repeatedly around cost and nobody wants it, and those point to policy failings that we've had for a really long time. It costs more for double glazing because it's not required. You're not going to see the cost come down unless you've got the scale required through minimum standards. Like, you can't even buy single glazing in Germany. It's what pisses me off. So that stuff, that needs to change through regulation. I think the move on existing buildings will create awareness at the consumer level, and I think that will grease the wheels for the conversation on minimum standards, because for the first time in a little while, you're seeing volume builders engage with things like GVCA's homes pilot, and they recognize that there's a market out there. It's small, but that will grow. So I think, some big players are starting to shift, I think, and their industry bodies need to do a bit of catching up.
Frankie, thank you very, very much. I've enormously enjoyed our conversation, and I think both you and Andrew have made a huge contribution, and both in Australia and him in New Zealand. And I think we just keep on pressing on. I think things will get better quickly, and so on. If you do have time, it would be great if you could maybe go to one of the meeting rooms, so that if folk have some questions, that they can ask them directly to you.